Last time we looked at a video by the Critical Drinker covering some of his issues with the characterization of Luke Skywalker. I wanted to set that issue up in advance so we can spend a little time covering some other specifics before we return to some generalities like in our first essay looking at Shadiversity. What's interesting about the creator MauLer is that he's known for producing mainly 3 well-known types of content. This isn't all he does, but they are some of his most famous pieces. The first is, of course, his reviews where he gives a play-by-play of an entire film, or in some cases a video, and gives his thoughts and reactions to it as a sort of review. The second is a sort of live-format podcast where he and a group of variable friends and other creators react to or discuss other content on the platform. These 2 formats might appear entirely different at first, but they do have a commonality in the form of a dedication to isolating individual moments of films or videos, or arguments, and zooming in on those moments. We'll return to this idea later as I find it intriguing as a format for analysis. The third type of content he's somewhat well known for is producing the occasional unbridled rage review. What separates these videos from his other content are 2 key factors that I was able to identify. The first is that they have a sort of comedic tonality to them. Not everything he says in the Unbridled Rage videos is a joke per se in the sense that he doesn't also believe it, but his points are delivered in the form of humor. Think of a channel like Nostalgia Critic or Angry Joe or some other similar content. These critics put their real beliefs on display, but they also do it in a style that appeals to some people because it presents those real beliefs in a manner that could inspire people to laugh or at least make them smile. This is also a staple of what I call the rage review genre, which MauLer didn't invent, obviously, but he is rather competent at it. The second factor in these videos that I was able to identify for educational purposes is that he doesn't extensively cover every moment of every item he reviews. Rather, it's a sort of comedic highlight reel of his opinions about a piece of media. I wanted to point this all out in advance because I've seen fans say that you can't criticize MauLer or take him at his word in these Unbridled Rage videos because he's joking. I agree that he's being humorous, but I'm not sure that I buy that he's kidding in the sense of being insincere. I think he's utilizing a kind of comedic sincerity. I don't want to belabor any point in these Last Jedi videos, because I never set out to exactly defend the film, only to learn from criticism of it. This being the final installment of the first of 3 trilogies of videos that I set out to make about the genre of Last Jedi YouTube critiques, I wanted to pause on a high note and consider the rage review genre. It's an interesting thing. Another YouTuber, FD Signifier, a critic with whom I have had, it must be said, a few disagreements here and there, has nonetheless used an interesting word to describe these critics: Augies. The term is an acronym that stands for Angry White Guy Yelling. He observes that these YouTubers are predominantly but not always white, predominantly but not always male, and present some sort of aggressive tonality to their audiences. Under this understanding, some of the people I've mentioned so far might be Augies, but I want to narrow things down a little bit. I'm talking about art critiques specifically here, so I think Rage Reviewer is a bit more precise. MauLer has also been criticized for doing longer critiques that aren't necessarily deep, but rather broad in scale. But for me to look at something like that, I'd have to comment on his The Last Jedi review, which would be quite long. If these videos get enough traction, I'll consider putting in the effort to produce a video like that, but seeing as I can't make a living from content creation at this very moment, I'll have to consider my own limitations for now. As things stand, I would love for anyone who thinks that I am mischaracterizing MauLer's views to point out which things specifically that I've zeroed in on he doesn't really believe, and perhaps I'll be able to return to that in the future. For now, it appears to me that the Unbridled Rage video on The Last Jedi does represent a humorous form of his real views on the film, and many of his viewers seem to take it in measure as exactly that. So pending specific correction of one of the points that I'm about to make with evidence to counter the statements from his video, which I'll be bringing up, I'll be treating MauLer's avowals as sincere overall. MauLer's The Last Jedi and Unbridled Rage appears to be the earliest of MauLer's Unbridled series of videos, and he opens it like this.
I watched this movie twice, and I'm pissed. I want to have a rant. So here we go. So the Republic is defeated and Snoke leads the reigning First Order as it mercilessly seizes control across the galaxy. What the fuck was the Republic? What the fuck was the First Order? Is the Republic the 5 planets that got wiped out in Force Awakens? Did we even get to see it in operation? They only said it was apparently a peaceful republic, and I suppose it did stuff. But then the fledgling and crippled Empire, now known as the First Order, no fuck that, they are the Empire, is able to wipe the Republic off the face of the Earth and run amok across the galaxy. Or scratch that, fuck taking over the galaxy. They're going to chase a fucking rebel cruiser. Sorry, I mean resistance cruiser. No, fuck that, they are the rebels. The entire fucking Empire is chasing a resistance cruiser in order to crush the Republic? What the fuck is going on in this world? The Republic was literally just those planets and Leia's cruiser, apparently. Where is the galaxy-wide outrage at the Empire for doing this shit? For mass murder? They just nuked all of the galaxy's leaders. Did nobody give a fuck? Did everyone just say, well, whatever, I guess. The Empire is now the leader until someone blows them up and then it's the Republic again. No allegiances, no factions, no protocol, no fucking repercussions. The rebels blew up the stupid Super Death Star, the only real threat the Empire had, so the galaxy should unite against one of the most terrifying acts of war and bloodshed ever known to the galaxy. Instead, we have no world building whatsoever.
Now, MauLer comes off like he edits the pauses between his statements out, so each thought of his just flows into the next, so it's a little difficult to know when to pause him, but I'd like to do so here to review his points about where the film picks up. Perhaps you can see why I wanted to do this one shortly after my previous Shadiversity video. Perhaps you can also see why I opened this video by talking about looking at MauLer's real views, because it does indeed appear that there's no preamble, either in the video or in the description at time of writing, which declares this to be satire entirely. I would wonder what he would be satirizing if that were the case. Maybe it would be a satire of himself? A satire of his colleagues to make them seem ridiculous for a laugh? Either way, it's working. MauLer's presentation here seems to be to pretend that he doesn't know what's going on in the film, which is a brilliant bit of comedy because it shows how laughable those complaints are. Obviously, the Republic, as established by the previous films, isn't just individual planets, but an interplanetary alliance with certain key places of importance. In this case, The Force Awakens shows the First Order striking a decisive and critical blow to the core of the Republic, which by implication in these films doesn't seem to have a military of its own, hence the need for a separate resistance. Actually, George Lucas set up why a body like the Republic might not want a large standing army quite well for us in his prequel trilogy, so thanks for that, George. That's really quite an interesting bit of information for interpreting these new films. MauLer also pretends not to know that a central theme of The Last Jedi is that the Resistance is being snuffed out by the First Order in retaliation for the destruction of Starkiller Base. I like that because it puts me in mind of two of the most critical moments of the film. One where Leia and the Resistance put out a call for help that no one answers, and one where Poe interprets Luke's actions as meaning that they are the spark that will start a fire that will burn the First Order to the ground. It's a cool series of moments in the films where you slowly get the impression that the Resistance are losing, that they stand alone, that they might lose, but that there's always hope. This sets up a problem for the third and final film, where a director and group of writers would have to come up with a way to play with these themes of isolation and hope against all odds. Because The Last Jedi is a sequel and not an adaptation, as well as being the middle point of a trilogy, we as the viewers can interpret this as meaning the previous death blow to the Republic has crippled or scared what might have been any potential for outside help, at least for now, but that some new alliance may be on the horizon. It's a nice bit of world building, which MauLer hilariously interprets as the absence of such. Now, I'm not going to go over everything MauLer says, because we've got some other videos to cover on other elements of this film, and I'd really be spoiling everything if I lingered too long on his every word. They were supposed to be quick videos when I started this series, after all.
Now that Poe has completed the Destroy Surface Cannons mini-quest, he has enough XP to unlock the Bomber ability, and summons Bomber-class ships out of thin fucking air. These are ships that the Empire only spot when they are right next to them, for fuck's sake. What the fuck? They are set to attack the Dreadnought, which is only now possible because he destroyed all of the surface cannons. Yes, apparently these guys are immune to TIE fighters or something and surface cannons are their only kryptonite. No, scratch that, one is shot by a handful of lasers immediately and is already down. What a retarded fucking plan. Who cares if the cannons are down when fighters can nuke them anyway? Not even that matters though, since there is a freak accident that causes half a TIE fighter to end up destroying 3 of the bombers, leaving 1 to get the job done. Honestly, what the fuck is the hull integrity of these ships when they can't handle space debris or fighter shots? They are meant to sustain a fucking assault long enough to reach a destroyer to deliver a payload, yet they die to a fucking handful of blasts from a TIE fighter.
This is another great bit from MauLer. Him pretending not to understand the language of cinema never gets old. It's a real laugh riot. It isn't really out of the ordinary that a TIE fighter barrage would destroy a ship that size, but more importantly, perhaps Rian Johnson and the writers were setting something up here by showing ships colliding. Maybe there's meant to be a kind of visual language here from which we could infer something. We'll have to think on that. I do like how MauLer refuses to include the shot of the X-Wings and A-Wings forming up to protect the bombers, something Poe directly calls out in the film, but without that visual or audio, you wouldn't know about it from his video. I'd like to return to the bombers in a future video, but I just wanted to include this bit. Poe takes out the cannons by flying low enough that he's a more difficult target, and using his speed and maneuverability to his advantage. The captain of the First Order Dreadnought specifically mentions that they should have scrambled their fighters previously, which is what gives Poe this opening. Things get more difficult as the battle progresses, but this shot of the bombers approaching is made possible by Poe's efforts, and is a reveal using dramatic film language, with the ships passing overhead to indicate the cavalry has arrived. The plan is a long shot, but thanks to the heroism of the many pilots, it just barely works. MauLer says,
on that note, how are the bombs even dropping down? Where the fuck is gravity coming from here?
This is interesting, since the visuals of the film indicate that the ships have some sort of gravity field inside them, so naturally when released, the bombs fall at the velocity through space at which they were falling when leaving the gravity of the ship. This is a pretty simple point. The film gives a pretty direct setup and payoff. MauLer's deliberate inability to understand the language of film is pretty thorough, to the point that he even shows the same kind of mistake that the critical drinker made in earnest when he says,
Rey mentions the Falcon and Luke is understandably upset that Han isn't the one explaining this shit and so asks, where is Han? And they fucking cut to the next scene. They cut to the next fucking scene. What the fuck?
I like these bits because it's either an intentional or unintentional indictment of a lot of the criticism of this film, showing how a lazy attitude towards cinema and art leads to misunderstandings that are then displaced from the critic onto the creatives responsible for the film. There's also a great bit in the video where MauLer describes Rose and Finn telling their discovery of how the First Order is tracking them, and they all come up with a secret plan to save the fleet. Listen to what he has to say.
Poe agrees to the whole thing, and so Finn and Shrek leave for Casino Land. Finn apparently knew about this tracker because he always mopped the tracker's room, and yet he hasn't told the rebellion that the Empire is capable of tracking through lightspeed. I guess he forgot.
The comedy in this is, of course, that like with the opening battle, MauLer is misinforming his audience about what happens in the film. I have to say that this is a little one-note comedically. MauLer is just cursing and being weird about a couple of the female characters in the film, while pretending to not understand it. If the joke is that people who make videos like this are bad at their jobs, I guess it's pretty funny, but it gets a little old at over 35 minutes. Anyway, Finn doesn't tell the Resistance about the First Order tracking through lightspeed because after he wakes up from being unconscious, while he does know where the components of the machinery being used to execute this plan is, he's only just figured out with Rose's help how the First Order is using the device to do so. MauLer just kind of passes over this, so naturally viewers of this video who don't remember or who haven't seen the film wouldn't be aware. But I'd like to look at some more interesting passages in this video.
Yoda then pops up, and it's probably the best scene in the film just for the novelty of the puppet alone, but they fuck it up anyway. Apparently Force Ghosts can now hit things and control lightning. That doesn't complicate anything, does it? I have read literal comments speculating that we can hope to see Force Ghosts fighting each other in the future now, since they have added this to the mythos. What the fuck?
This video is getting demonetized, isn't it? Well, whatever. This is interesting to me because in this video MauLer sort of glosses over the earlier part of the film where Luke explains the actual relationship of the light to the dark sides of the Force. The light side contains the balance, life, and death, and so on, whereas the dark side balances the light. This is interesting for reasons not the least of which being that it plays into the later scene of Rey going beneath the island looking into the mirror to find the answer to the question burning inside her, which is not only who her parents are, but also on a deeper level who she is. The mirror shows her standing among herselves, leading into a chain of selves that leads back only to herself. She is alone. Rey is called to the darkness because it gives her a sense of control over this question. She's pulled to the dark side because, like Yoda says in a previous film, it is easier. Easy answers, though, aren't always the right ones. The dark side isn't stronger, and in a way, Force Ghosts are evidence of this. The dark side in these films tempts in part with the allure of conquering one's fears by seizing control over them, including the fear of death. This is how Anakin is turned. Rey faces a similar temptation in this film, and we can marry this to Ben's words to Luke in Empire Strikes Back by understanding that while Ben couldn't intervene in a battle of light and darkness between two living Force users engaged in a personal, philosophical, and spiritual confrontation, it may have been possible for them to help in other ways. For example, a Force ghost can interact with their environment by speaking, being seen, standing, walking, or sitting. In these later films, Force ghosts can also move elements out of the environment, and is that so hard to believe? Is the lore really being altered here? A Force ghost is a persona maintained as an impression in the Force via the process of relinquishing oneself into the Force upon death. It comes from a certain understanding of what the Force and death even are. When Yoda says his ally is the Force, does he mean that it's a tool? No. The Force is alive. The Jedi interpret it as having a will of its own. An individual maintaining themselves within that Force after death can keep their persona, but they can also interact if the Force wills it, seemingly. That thunderstorm, that bolt of lightning, that tree, all these things are in and a part of the Force. The Force is everything. Yoda isn't striking against the dark side here. He's offering guidance to Luke. The lightning could just as easily have struck the tree incidentally, but instead Yoda guided it. He only did what was already possible, just as his words only guide Luke to know what he already knows. In a way, it's a beautiful and poetic moment that feeds into the world as opposed to violating precedent in the way that MauLer seems to believe. Ironically, the Sith perspective on the Force as something to center individual power and control over the world also seems to be how MauLer and some others interpret the implications of this scene. But this isn't an exertion of personal power, it's an expression of the will of the Force. Understanding that is understanding that here, the truth of the Jedi philosophy is being reasserted, that it isn't time for the Jedi to end, but for them to be understood correctly. Anyone agreeing with MauLer here doesn't understand the Jedi or the Force. The Jedi surrender to the Force. Luke has hitherto attempted to cut himself off from something to which his previous mistake with Kylo indicates he was interacting with in part by believing he could control the outcome. In blaming himself for the creation of Kylo Ren, and subsequently taking his hands off the situation, he again implies that he was in control of the situation as opposed to only his actions. But his will is not the will of the Force. Luke, by the end of the film, acts by not acting, taking responsibility while also surrendering to the will of the Force. This is the kind of attitude that he would have to become a Force ghost. This is the perfect unity of the philosophy of the Force in this film.
People here then hyperdrives into the Star Destroyer ship thing, and honestly this is the most incredible shot in the film. Gorgeous, creative, and dumb as fuck. If this is something they could have been doing, then why the hell haven't they made ships specifically designed to hyperdrive into all of the large and destructive ships for battle? Hell, this might actually work on the fucking Death Stars. What are you doing, film? What the fuck?
Now obviously if MauLer's video was serious, he'd be considering how, in a film like this, assuming an action by the characters violates the lore without exploring why it might have just been a new precedent, or otherwise had an unexplored explanation, is kind of fallacious reasoning. We'll return to this in a future video, so for now let's just note down that it's an interesting point to consider that lots of people seem uninterested in why the Holdo maneuver is a rare occurrence despite any potential explanations, and seem more preoccupied with assuming there aren't any. I do agree that there are interesting implications here and that the shot is visually impressive. It's actually arguably more impressive in theaters, where the shot being silent is played for effect. I remember a lot of people liking that when I first saw it. File this one away for part 5 in this video series, folks.
Then everyone in the ships except the characters with lines die, and Poe says, fuck it, let's go back, whatever. Poe literally says that it's a suicide run, and despite that, Finn says he can do it. Finn has a character moment. He spent his time running from the enemy, running to avoid the hurt, concerned only with himself and Rey. And here, his values have changed. He values the people, the resistance, and this will save them all. Sacrifice yourself, destroy the Canon, and you can save the Rebel Alliance. But nah, Shrek pops out from the side and saves him for doing something right. How the fuck didn't Shrek explode by plowing into Finn? How the hell weren't they shot on the way there when everyone else was? How the hell didn't the AT-ATs actually shoot them once they had landed and just sat right outside them? How the fuck didn't the laser just melt them anyway? Ah, fuck off, film. Shrek then says you don't want to win by fighting what you hate, you have to do it by saving what you love. This makes no goddamn fucking sense, and it's why I hate this character. Her sister died destroying the symbol of hate, the Dreadnought, a fleet killer. She dies to potentially save thousands by targeting hate directly. By stopping Finn from destroying the Canon, you not only stole a great character moment from him, but you let the Empire blow up the only safe haven for the rebels and thus doomed them all to death, you fucking idiot.
You know, I'm starting to pick up on some real emotion behind those words. I think these might just represent MauLer's actual feelings. Maybe it being a joke or a bit is just sort of an insincere tonality masking genuine controller-smashing gamer rage. I don't know, man, but it feels a little inappropriate. In order to justify seething this much, he has to ask questions as if those questions aren't answered, and deliberately chooses to misunderstand how the themes of the film come together. Remember what we noted was the thesis statement of the film that gets stated when the Resistance flees their base, and restated time and time again in this film? People are more important than things. Lives are precious. Hope finds a way. All of these are valid answers to the question, what is the central theme of this film? Poe's moment calling off the suicide run is part of his arc in this film because he grows as a leader. Finn's moment is also part of his because he has to grow as an individual who puts the cause before himself. But Rose has an actual point when she stops Finn from sacrificing himself. You see, MauLer has to set this up in a way that makes it seem like Rose is sacrificing the Resistance, but that base was definitely not safe. If Resistance soldiers can get in, so can First Order stormtroopers. And if there really is no other way out, then the rebels aren't safe. It's not a safe haven. If anything, until they all run out to the back exit, it basically looks like a big salted tombstone with an epitaph on it that nobody's going to read. Meanwhile, MauLer twists Rose's motivations to make her seem like she's neglecting her sister's sacrifice. But if anything, one could easily see how her sister's death and the deaths of so many others in this film are all impacting her decision to stop Finn from giving up his life. The First Order can afford to lose a Canon at this point more than the Resistance can afford to lose a hero. And she knows it. To answer MauLer's questions rapid fire, Rose doesn't explode because her speeder impacts Finn's indirectly. The AT-ATs don't shoot them because their speeders are already destroyed and they're either not a threat or may not even appear on their scanners. They aren't shot on the way there because the point of sending multiple people is that many will die, but some might make it as a gamble. And the laser doesn't melt them anyway because they're off to the side, which is also how the rest of the Resistance take cover, by moving to the side. What's interesting is that these are easy inferences to make once you start treating the film as capable of setting its own precedents and implications. MauLer's video asks these questions but doesn't explore them, and he treats elements of the film in isolation of each other, without asking or answering questions that might allow him to learn from the film. In fact, he primarily asks questions with the intent of not getting constructive answers. As per usual, every idea, every moment, every frame exists only in relation to itself, and will be judged in only the MauLer-approved context. Unanswered questions aren't our fault for not wanting to explore them, they're the film's fault for making us ask. We have to behave as if we have no brains at all, as if we're born yesterday. In fact, this reminds me of a concept I encountered in a course in my philosophy minor, where a professor introduced the Buddhist idea of setsuna. In this context, the concept of setsuna sophistry is when critics tee off easy criticisms by taking moments of a work or idea in isolation when convenient, where every criticism they advance is unaccountable to each other criticism they advance, except where it's also convenient for the critic. This is a deep cut for longtime viewers of this channel, as I mentioned this idea once before, years ago, when I used to do vlogs. MauLer's content requires a sort of impermanence of thought, except in this sense we're dealing with a lack of mindfulness as opposed to the presence of mindfulness. This is reinforced by how he structures much of his work and argues his points. He ends his video with an acknowledgement that this video will have poorly argued or incorrect observations, so I guess we have common ground, but I'd argue that this isn't an aberration and is a common theme in a lot of his work. But if you want me to write notes on his entire Last Jedi review, I'd honestly wait until YouTube can be a full-time job. We gotta get those subscriber and Patreon numbers up. Those are rookie numbers. Because while I don't like MauLer's content, he does clearly put the effort in, and I'd feel bad not doing the same if I wanted to address all of his points together. So, despite my feelings and his, consider this a small, brief, limited look into just a couple of the things he said about this film way back when, as part of a larger review of the phenomenon of the Last Jedi reviews, and not as a complete condemnation of all of his thoughts and feelings, and we'll call it even. The genre of the Rage review is large and bloated here on YouTube, and we've got many more videos to cover in this series before we're through. For now, however, this is Chariot signing off, and I'll see you very soon when we return to the work of an old friend of the channel.